Gracious God, grant us to seek the truth, come whence it may, cost what it will. Amen. Today the church remembers the feast of the presentation of Jesus in the temple. It's part of the nativity stories. So if your Christmas tree is still up, it's still Christmas. As the gospel writer tells us, 40 days after the firstborn son was born, he would be brought to the temple, and parents would bring an offering because firstborn sons belong to God. And so Mary and Joseph did that for Jesus. They wanted to keep the traditions of their faith and their people. And when they came to the temple, there they saw these two elders, Simeon and Anna, who visited the temple regularly, devotedly waiting for the coming of the Messiah. And on that day, they met the Messiah. And Simeon prayed, "My eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles, and for glory to your people Israel." My eyes have seen a light for revelation. Light is a big theme in this season of Epiphany, a season that marks the revelation of Christ, who is the light of the world. Light allows us to see the path. Light dispels shadows. Light brings clarity. And in the feast of the presentation, we remember that these elders had waited and waited and waited, holding on to hope by faith for the light to be revealed, for salvation to come. And they got to see that promise when they met Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, the light of the world. In many parts of Latin America and in parts of Europe and parts of the world, this feast is Candlemas. And it's a big celebration. It's the end of the Christmas season, which I'm totally okay with. And we celebrate by bringing candles to church to be blessed. Candles that people keep in sacred spaces and their altars. And we do that in processions because Jesus is the light of the world. Jesus is the light of the world. Now think about this. Candles and lamps have been a central part of life throughout the centuries. The only source of light when it was dark outside, or even indoors if you didn't have a lot of access to the outside. There's no electricity. There's no LEDs. No mood lighting. Although I suppose the candles are kind of mood lighting, but that wasn't the point. Just candles and oil lamps. So when people brought candles to be blessed at church on Candlemas, they're really asking for God's blessing on an essential tool of their life, just like the light of Christ is an essential part of our lives. So as you can imagine, I've been thinking a lot about candles and lights and lamps. And this story from my childhood came to me that I want to share with you. Many of you know that I'm originally from Puerto Rico, and I'm an immigrant. And our beautiful island is blessed with many things, like delicious food and joyful people and beautiful natural landscapes. And at the same time, our island is susceptible to significant challenges, like extreme heat and sandstorms from the Sahara that come all the way across the world. I don't know how, but it happens. And hurricanes. I've experienced many hurricanes in my life, but the first one that I can really remember was Hurricane Hortense in September of 1996. I had just turned 9 years old, and I remember distinctly the preparations, bringing all the canned foods and the non-perishables and the drinking water, shuttering the windows, bringing the sandbags, and most importantly, los quinqués. Quinqué is the Puerto Rican word for oil lamp, with their basins for kerosene, a wick, and a glass cover. Before electricity, these were the main sources of light for people in the island, especially in rural communities. I know in many places, these types of lamps were important. My grandfather had many of them in his house, and my family had them as an important part of preparing for hurricane season. When the power went out, the quinqué gave off a lot of light. It's better than the flashlights. I have very vivid memories of Hurricane Hortense. My parents and my sister and I huddling in the family room. I remember the rain falling hard against the window shutters. I could hear the creepy sound of the wind, like a humpback whale. Ooh, ooh. I could hear the trees swaying. We had all kinds of trees: avocado, oranges, grapefruits, lemons, palm trees, breadfruit. And I could hear the branches breaking off and falling, the water rushing down the hill. And through it all, scary as it was, the light of the quinqué oil lamp was our source of light. The dancing flame mesmerized me, still does. I love to watch the flames of the candles. In our darkness, that light allowed us to see one another and what we were doing. It allowed us to see our food so we could eat. It allowed us to find our way in a dark house. The flame allowed us to feel less afraid. I think that Simeon and Anna knew a thing or two about living through this tough, scary, and oppressive times. Times that felt dark and wind-battered like a hurricane. And yet, in the ups and downs of life in first century Palestine, they kept going back to the temple for prayer and for study. Regardless of the demands of the emperor, the social inequality that existed, the ways that imperial soldiers restricted or blocked access to gathering and worship, those who took advantage of the people who were not Roman, or even the people who thought they were a little crazy, hoping and searching for hope in a very dark time, Simeon and Anna still found their way to the temple to pray. For decades, they searched with hope, guided by faith. Think about it. They were elders. Anna was 84, and every day she made her way to the temple. Simeon also advanced in age. Every day made it to the temple. They trusted the promise that they had received from God that the Messiah would come. Their prayers, their faith, it was like a candle that lit their path in that turbulent time. Now, I want to be clear about something. Many people think that having faith is like wishful thinking or positive thinking. Things will be better, I'm sure. You just have to look at the positive side. It's a nice slogan, and it can be somewhat encouraging, make us feel better. But beloved, I don't think that wishful thinking can carry us for decades of our lives under the occupation of an empire. I think the faith that Simeon and Anna held was more than just hoping and wishing and thinking that it was going to get better. Rather, their whole lives were oriented toward an ideal, toward a goal. And that goal was the fulfillment of God's plan of salvation for their people, for their nation, and for all. They lived their lives oriented toward this truth, the search for liberation for all, not their personal gain, not their personal desires and personal power. So they chose to go up to the temple. And this wasn't just like, oh, I like to go to church and I'll sit and I'll sort of meditate and say. Being in the temple was not just sitting in the pew watching things happen. Being in the temple meant that they were gathering with others in community, that they were praying together and affirming their faith, that they were studying the ancient traditions, they were studying the scriptures, they were trying to wrestle with what those scriptures meant. They were organizing as a community in the temple, and they made plans for how to build their people and their community. So in this case, being in the temple was not just worshipful. It was community building. It was community oriented. And that's how their faith survived. That's how their faith was strengthened. That's how the light became brighter. Anna and Simeon's faith was an active certainty that God would act, even if they weren't the ones who would see it, even if they weren't the ones who would directly benefit from it. They lived their lives transformed by that for which they hoped for, the message of the Messiah, the light of Christ. Beloved of God, we need this faith for ourselves as we navigate our world right now. We need a faith that orients our lives toward God's plan of salvation, which is a plan that brings love, wholeness, restoration to all people. We need a faith that lights our path to make decisions for how we interact with our loved ones and our neighbors, how we spend our time at work and at home, how we organize, and how we resist. If we're going to get through the turbulent times, it's not because we raged harder than the others. It's not because we bury our heads and sort of forget and ignore things. It's because we live our lives reflecting the light of Christ. Joy, compassion, mercy, humility, and love. As you go forth this week, reflect the light of Christ in your home, in your workplace, with your friends and your family, with your neighbors, with those you agree and with those you disagree. May your words and your actions showcase what it is that you hope for, what it is that you see. And may your hopes be rooted in the good news of salvation for all peoples. May you shine with the light of Christ. Amen.